Welcome everybody to our Python series. In this video, we're going to talk about conditional statements and loops in Python. So what exactly are conditional statements? Let's say you're sitting in your home on a Sunday afternoon and you decide to go out with your friends because you don't have any work to do. So this is a conditional statement. If I don't have any work to do and it's a Sunday, I'll go and play with my friends. So this is exactly how conditional statement works in Python as well. And let's see how do we use that. So without any ado, let's quickly go to our Jupyter notebook. And let's create a new file. I'll call that, let's call it conditional statements. And loops. Okay. So basically the syntax of if else, which is how you write conditional statements in Python, goes something like this. So if, let's say, condition 1 is true, it's true, then we perform action 1. Let's say action 1, and else if condition 2 is true, then we perform action 2. So this is how it works, okay? So if I run this, so let's see quickly how do we use this in a simple example. Suppose I input a number n and I want to check whether this number is even or odd, right? So let's input a number. So remember we talked about this, whenever you input something in Python, its default data type is always string, right? And we can't really check whether a string is even or odd, so we want to convert this to an integer. So I can just write that n is equal to int of n. Remember type conversion? Now what I do is, I check the remainder when I divide this number by 2. So for the syntax for that would be n mod 2 equal to 0. So equal to is how you check statements in Python, okay? So n mod 2 will give you the remainder when you divide n by 2, and we want to check whether it's equal to 0. If it's equal to 0, we know that the number has to be even, right? So we'll print it's even. If not, see, the alternate over here is if the number is not even, it has to be odd, right? So I can simply write else print it's odd. And if I run this code, let's see what happens. So let's input a number, for example, 23. So you can see that it returns odd, right? If I run this again, let's say with an even number, let's go with 10, you'll see that it returns even, right? So these are the two conditions. So my condition here was the remainder I get when I divide this number by 2. Now in this case, we only had two cases, right? Either it's even or odd. What happens when you have multiple conditions? For that, there is something else known as else if, okay? So it would go something like this. So instead of these two, what you do is, between these two, you'll add this one extra line, which is elif condition. Let's say, let's call this 2, and this one will become 3. This will be 3, and you have your action 2 over here, right? So this is how else if works, okay? Even though we call it else if, the syntax for that is going to be elif, all right? So if I want to give you an example for this, let's work with a similar example. Suppose I input a number. Once again, so let's just paste this code. I want to check the remainder when I divide this number by 3. Let's take a very simple example. So if n mod 2, or rather n mod 3 is equal to 0, I want to print that remainder is 0, right? Similarly, if the remainder is 1, I want to print that it's 1, right? But this, in this case, is not the only other option, right? We have other options as well. So I'll add elif over here. Elif n mod 3 equal to 1. Then I print that the remainder is 1. Now I know that if 0 and 1 are covered, the only other case remaining is the remainder has to be 2, right? So for the last one, I can directly just write else print remainder is 2, okay? Let's see what happens when I run this code. So if I run this, I'll have to input a number. Let's go with 30. Very simple. It's divisible by 3. So the remainder is 0, right? If I run this again, and let's say I input a number, let's say 31. Okay, so the remainder is 1. Similarly, if I go with 32, you can see it prints remainder is 2, right? So this is exactly how conditional statements work. In case you have more conditions, you can always just keep on adding more elif in between, okay? So you start off with the if, you end with the else, and in between you can add as many conditions as you want. But always remember, once you put this conditional statement, don't forget this colon in the end. Otherwise, Python won't understand that it's a conditional statement. So this covers conditional statements mostly. Now we'll come and talk about loops. Now, what exactly is a loop? A loop is basically, in some sense, a closed circuit where you're doing the same action or a similar action multiple times. It could be as simple as printing the first 50 numbers, it could be printing the same number 50 times, or anything of that sort, right? So for this, we use loops in Python. So every loop, in general, we only have two loops in Python. We have for and we have the while loop. Now, in for and while, there is a slight difference. For example, when we say for, whenever we write for, in general, we specify the starting point and the end point, right? So for values in a certain set, for a certain number of times, we'll use for. We use while when we have conditional loops. For example, while a certain condition is true, I want to repeat this action, right? So that is the primary difference between these two. So let's see what the syntax is for using for loop in Python. So I'll explain the syntax while I'm writing it. So you start off with a for, which tells Python that it's a for loop. I is essentially, or it could be anything, it could be I, J, K, whatever you want to write. That is basically your loop variable. So let's use I for now. So for I, in range, let's say 10. So what this tells Python is, I is my loop variable, the range is 10, okay? So it basically tells Python how many times is the loop going to run for, okay? So in this case, it will run 10 times. The value of I ranges from 0 to 10 minus 1, so 9. It works the same way as strings and lists, okay? So the values of I are going to be 0 to 9 and it runs for 10 times. So let's perform a simple action. Again, you have to write a colon at the end to make sure that Python understands that it's a for loop. And the action could be as simple as printing my name 10 times, okay? So if I print my name, let's see what happens. You'll see that it printed my name 10 times, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, okay? So this is the first action. I could also do something like this. For example, I could just print the first 10 numbers. For that, I'll just remove my name and I'll just say Python to print the value of I. And if you print this, you can see that it actually prints the value of I, 0 to 9, because these are the values that I will take, right? So if you want the first 10 natural numbers, you can just add I plus 1, right? So if you do that, you'll see that it printed 1 to 10. You can change this to 50 and you'll get the first 50 natural numbers, right? So 1 all the way till 50. As simple as that. Right, so in this case, the main point is that you know how many times your loop has to run initially, okay? Before you start coding, you know how many times your loop is going to run, right? But when it comes to while, you don't really know how many times is the loop going to run, all right? So over there, we need a condition, right? So while is essentially a conditional loop, right? So before we go to while, let's look at a few more applications of for loop. So remember this line, the first line for I in range 50. It could be anything. One more thing you can do is, so whenever you write range, okay, let's just add a comment here. So when you write range, it's always the starting point followed by the ending point and the step size, okay? So what does the step size mean? So if you look at the previous example, this previous code that we ran, over here the value of I was increasing by 1 at every step. So the increment was always by plus 1. If you mention the step size to be something other than 1, or rather if you just enter it, Python will consider it to be the step size. If nothing is given, it's taken to be 1 by default. So I could use this. Let's say I just want to print the even numbers, right? So for that, what I can do is, for I in range 50, let's go with, okay, so let's look at this. So starting point is 1, okay? So I starts from 1, goes all the way till, let's say, 21. Okay, so the values of I are essentially between 1 and 20. And suppose I want to print the even numbers. So my step size has to be 2, right? Okay, technically 1 is not an even number, so I should start from 2. So if we go from 2 to 21 with a step size 2, and I just print I, right? I can print I. You can see that it prints all the even numbers, right? Let's understand why this works. The first value of I is 2. Okay, so it will print 2 obviously. But now because the step size is 2, the next number that we'll consider, or rather Python will consider, is 2 plus 2, which is 4. After that, it goes for 4 plus 2, which is 6, and so on and so forth. If I change this slightly, you can also print all the odd numbers, right? So you can see 135 all the way till 19. Okay, so this is essentially the point of a step size. You could use this to print an AP, for example. Suppose you want a AP. So let's recall what an AP is. So arithmetic progression, AP is basically where you have the first number given by A. So this is your first value or initial value. Then you have, let's say, the number of terms you want to print, right? So, or rather, let's say the first 10 terms of the AP or first n number of terms smaller than 50, okay? So let's say in this case, we have the upper bound given to us, let's say, okay? So values before 50 and the step size, which is basically the common difference of the AP, it's given to us as 5, okay? So the AP starts with the initial value. The next term is going to be the initial value plus 5. The next step is going to be the second term plus 5 and so on and so forth, right? So if I start with initial value equal to 1 and generate an AP, let's see what happens. So I could go for I in range. So my first term is 1, right? So I'll write that here. 50 is my upper bound, right? So I want to print all the numbers, let's say strictly before 50, okay? So I'll enter 50 as my endpoint and my step size is going to be 5, right? And let's print the values of I in this case. Let's print I and you'll see it prints 1, then 6, then 11 and so on and so forth. So this is exactly what an AP looks like, right? So you can use this to generate an AP as well. For loops are not just restricted to numbers and ranges which deal with numbers. You could do weird stuff like you could run your loop over a string. For example, let's say I put my name as my string. So let's take Shreyam. And let's say I want to print all the characters in my name, right? So for that, what I do is I just write for S in capital S and I print the characters, right? Let's go with this. So if you see, the output is basically all the characters of my name. So what Python is doing in this case is it's basically working over the string, starting from the first character all the way till the end character, right? So it first print capital S, then will print small h, then R, then so on and so forth, right? So you can loop it over a string. It could be a sentence as well. For example, Shreyam is coding right now. Right? And if I run this, you'll see that it also considers the spaces, right? Because spaces are also characters when you're talking about strings, right? So Shreyam is coding right now. It prints that, right? So it could also be over a list, for example. Just like a string, you can also loop your for loop over a particular list. For example, if I take L equal to, let's say the first 10 numbers, right? 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then 10, okay? And if I write for I in this list, and I print the elements of the list, then let's see what happens when you look at the output. Okay, sorry, I shouldn't have printed the list. So what this basically did was it ran over the entire list, right? So it had 10 options and every time it printed the list, right? Because I wrote print L instead of print I. But if I write print I, you can see that it prints the elements of the list, right? So for loops are very flexible and they're very powerful. In fact, we'll show you problems where we use loops and conditional statements together. Right, so this was all about for loops for the time being. Next thing we'll talk about is while loop. So remember I said while is always followed by a condition, right? So you have some condition here, you put a colon and then you do whatever you want to do, okay? So body of the loop, right? So whatever you want to do, the actions, you do it inside that, right? So this while loop runs as long as this condition is true. So for example, I could do something like while, let's say I is strictly smaller than 50, okay? So over here, you'll have to define a like initial value for I, right? For example, let's say I starts with 0. So I less than 50 and I write print I, okay? So it could be multiple statements as well, right? For example, I write print I and then I want to increment the value of I. So in case of a for loop, all these things were given inside the for statement, right? The initial value, the increment value and so on and so forth, right? But in case of a while, all you have is a condition, right? So any other values that you might be using, you have to predefine it or you have to define it inside the body of the loop. For example, in this case, I'll increment my value by I5, okay? So what happens if I do this? So it'll print all the values of I, incrementing them by 1 as long as I is strictly smaller than 50. So in some sense over here we printed a AP as well with initial value 0, common difference 5 and all the values less than 50. Now sometimes you might want to use conditional statements and loops in the same code, right? For example, I could run the values of I from 1 to 20 and if the value of I is odd, I want to print that the number is odd and if it's even, I want to print that the number is even. So if I could go with for I in range, let's say 20, let's go with 21. If I, so I mod 2 equal to 0, I want to print that I is even. Now see, when you're trying to print something, you can only print strings plus some message as we had done previously. You can't really use an integer type plus something, okay? It doesn't work. So what I can do is I can force my I to become a string for the time being and then I can add the extra message that space is even and similarly otherwise I can print that it's odd. I want to print that I plus is odd, right? And if I run this code, you can see what happens. So you got that 0 is even, 1 is odd, 2 is even, 3 is odd, so on and so forth, right? So I mean this is a very simple and lame example, but you get the idea, right? So you could incorporate conditional statements inside loops, you can come up with more complex things that you might need, alright? Okay. One more thing that we can do in loops and conditional statements is continue or break, okay? We use it mostly for loops because conditional statements are just 2 lines, okay? So we don't really need to use it there. But basically the idea of continue is whatever statement or whatever action you're trying to do for a certain value of I, you skip that step, okay? For example, if the value of the loop variable is some particular value, okay? Loop variable is equal to let's say some value k, then I skip that particular step, right? So let's look at an example. For example, if you look at the previous code, okay? Let's say I want this exact same code, but now I only want to print the even numbers and skip the odd numbers. So for that, what we can do is I'll copy this exact same code, and whenever I takes an odd value, I'll just skip that step. So I just write continue, okay? And what this will do is it'll skip every time the value of I is odd, okay? So you can see 0, 2, 4, 6, so on and so forth. I could have done it the other way around as well. So for example, if I change this, let's say I only want the odd numbers, I can continue for all the even values of I, right? So if I do this, you can see it prints only the odd numbers, right? So that's basically the idea of continue. Now, when we look at break, see, for example, let's say I run an infinite loop again, right? So I greater than 0 with the initial value of I as 1. And we know that if I print the value of I, it will be an infinite loop, right? But we don't want that. So what I'll do is, so I'll go with print I, okay? And I'll go with I equal to I plus 1. And then I'll add an extra conditional statement that if I is greater than 500, then I want this loop to stop, okay? Then what I can do is, if this, then I do break, okay? So if I run this code, you can see that it prints all the value till 500 and then it will break out from the loop, all right? That's the idea, okay? So you can use break in case you don't really know when the condition is going to become false, right? Because initially you might give a statement or a condition that's always true, and at some point inside the loop you feel like this is the point where I want to stop. So in those cases you can use your break statement, right? So this is how you use conditional statements and loops in Python. We'll come up with a video where we show how to use this in daily problems, or rather like coding problems, how do we use loops and conditional statements, alright? So if you like this video, do let us know in the comments. Also, a Telegram group link is given in the description. Make sure you join this because we are going to come up with lots of fun coding problems and practice problems for you. So if you want access to those, make sure you join that group. Bye.